sources, research, and credible and scholarly sources. And this video is something you might want to watch and then refer back to, because I'm going to provide the basic overview of credible sources, scholarly sources, and everything else. So a credible source can be broken down into some general categories, but in any case, you need to also apply critical thinking skills to deciding whether a source is credible or not. And part of the learning process might be, if you have a question, if you're not sure about whether a source you want to use qualifies as credible, drop me a note. We can have a Zoom chat, we can exchange emails or texts, and we can talk about it. But here's a list of how to start. So legitimate news providers constitute a credible source. Now, I'm a former journalist. I spent 37 years as a journalist, and my current perspective is that most sources that call themselves news are not news. And there are some basic ideas I'm going to talk about in the next slide about how to differentiate between a really legitimate news source and all the rest. So accredited colleges and universities are credible and sometimes scholarly sources depending on the type of information they're providing you. Now, accredited is a key word here because there are some colleges and universities out there that aren't true colleges or universities in the traditional sense that I'm talking about, and so they need to be fully accredited. An example of a credible source, let's say you're doing something on Thomas Jefferson and you want to access something he said. Well, there's a lot of stuff on the internet quoting Thomas Jefferson that isn't correct. It's made up or it's used out of context. So you would want to go to the place where his papers and letters are archived, and that is the University of Virginia. They have an enormous online archive of his stuff. That's an example. Government statistics and data, so government sources, U.S. Department of Labor, Bureau of Census, state government sources that gather information and provide it are credible sources. If you're using information that you get out of a blog site or a news article, it's always better, if you're going to cite that information, to go to the original source rather than to quote the blog. Blog sites are not credible sources pretty much ever, but they might have information in them that is credible. And so they tell you that the U.S. Department of Agriculture says Idaho grows 80 trillion potatoes a year. Just go to the USDA and get that information. So real, legitimate dictionaries and encyclopedias that are available easily online. That does not include wiki encyclopedias or dictionaries. So Wikipedia, those kinds of things, no. Wiki has been around for about 30 or 40 years, and these are sites that are created by the public. The name wiki comes from wiki, a Hawaiian term meaning vast. And sometimes information on Wikipedia is perfectly acceptable, and sometimes it's just dead wrong. I don't accept Wikipedia as a source. Some nonprofit organizations are very good sources and some are not. I'm going to talk about that a little bit here more in a minute. And then scholarly sources, which I will talk about more in a minute as well, also qualify as credible sources, so they certainly can be used. Do not ever, in a paper, presentation, project, say according to Google or according to the internet or according to something.com. Something.com isn't a source. It's the name of a website. Tell me what the source is. It's not uscensus.gov. It's the U.S. Census Bureau. It may sound like a trivial difference, but it's not. So just a quick comment or two about how to evaluate a source that isn't clearly credible. You have to use some judgment. These include news sources and advocacy sites. What I mean by news sources is something that says it's news may or may not be. So find a tab, a link on their website that says About Us or About. And if they don't have one, you're already done. And then if they do, learn about their approach to providing information. Do they have a mission statement? Do they have ethical standards? Do they tell you how they're funded? Do they tell you who their board of directors is? How do they go about their business and what's their purpose? And then you need to apply critical thinking skills to decide if it's something that can be considered credible. Do they tell you where their information comes from, whether it's a news story or an advocacy site? Now, what do I mean by advocacy? So these are sites like Planned Parenthood, not sites, but organizations. Planned Parenthood, NRA. These might be perfectly fine sites, but they have an axe to grind. They're trying to push forward a specific agenda, and that makes the information for our purposes somewhat worrisome. And so be very careful when you're using a site that is trying to put forward a political or other kind of position. Just some final notes on all of this. Again, you need to practice this. When you get to a point where you're not sure about something, ask me. When in doubt, don't use a source. Don't use blog sources. Don't use sources that don't fit the definition that I'm talking about here as either credible or scholarly. So all scholarly sources, because a scholarly source is, by definition, something that has been reviewed by academic peers. And so it's going to appear in a scholarly journal or in a book that has been reviewed by academic peers. That doesn't necessarily mean it's that all information that's been peer reviewed is perfect. No, but it rises to a higher standard for us, and so you are authorized to use it. So all scholarly sources are credible. Not all credible sources are scholarly. And so, you can use either credible or scholarly sources depending on what is called for in the specific assignment. Some of my assignments require only scholarly sources. Some allow for only credible sources or beyond, and some require some of each. So make sure that you read the assignment and know what the requirements are. So out, not available to you for use for our purposes, are anecdotes or opinions, stories that people tell, that this thing happened to me and therefore it's true. Well, it may be true, but it may or may not be relevant to what you're talking about. Opinion pieces, unless you're using them to help illustrate some kind of point, that how an opinion that you read can be challenged, or how a story is out there and you're analyzing it somehow, that might work. You can just ask me about it. So, and then there's all the other stuff that's on the internet, which constitutes about 95% of what's out there. Conspiracy theories, lies, misinformation, disinformation, all of that kind of stuff. You can't use it, and you need to learn how to separate that stuff out. And when you do a Google search, that's most of what you're going to find. So you're going to need to then apply your critical thinking skills and make some decisions. And when you run into a situation where you're not quite sure, that's when you reach out to me. We can have a conversation either through text or email, or I'm happy to get on a quick Zoom and we can go through it and I can walk you through. So I encourage you, once you've viewed this video, come back to it from time to time as a refresher as you're working on your assignments.